Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, we are learning about World War II week by week. This is week 23. Join me. Let's go. Back to Finland. The Soviet hammer strikes hard at Finland, February 2nd, 1940. Let's continue. Lock in.
Yeah. Onnea.
Onnea.
February 2nd, 1940. In December, the Finns had humiliated the invading Soviet Red Army in the field. But throughout January, the Soviets had been planning and organizing for a massive new assault. This week, that assault begins.
Yeah, the Soviets seem to be one of the few armies that can just afford a lot of failed incursions because they're like, okay, what we do wrong? Next wave of guys. Next wave.
I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British made a strong step on the road to cracking Enigma, the complex German encoding system. The Russians continued their military buildup in Karelia, the French were bored of inaction in the West, and the Germans were restructuring their economy. They were also still making war plans, of course. On the 27th, the German plans for invading Norway become more formal. It now has the name Weserübung, referring to the river Weser and exercise, so Operation Weser Exercise. Back in December, Admiral Erich Raeder had brought Vidkun Quisling to meet Hitler. Quisling is the head of the pro-Nazi movement, a small one, in Norway, and he helped convince Hitler how vital occupying Norway is. Raeder is worried that a British presence in southern Norway might cut off the Baltic, but there had actually been British plans afoot for more than that. Operation Catherine. This was First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's plan for super armored battleships to launch an offensive into the Baltic Sea. Seriously, Churchill wanted to send in 3 Revenge-class battleships, flotillas of cruisers and destroyers, submarines, an aircraft carrier, the whole 9 yards. The battleships, the Sovereign, the Revenge, and the Resolution, would need to be modified, though, since the Baltic waters are shallower than the Atlantic. The ships would become slower than they were now, which was already the slowest capital ships in the Royal Navy since they'd been laid down before World War I. But in the narrow channels of the Baltic, that wouldn't matter, and their 15-inch batteries could outshoot German capital ships like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, at least until Germany's 15-inch gun battleships Bismarck and
So these things are just to allow the recoil of the gun and also not make it so that you don't get debris into here, right? That's what I'm assuming these bag things are for.
And Gneisenau, at least until Germany's 15-inch gun battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz could be completed and commissioned into the German Navy. Churchill saw a window of opportunity and envisioned these to be armored turtles, and that's important, the armor. Churchill thought an attack by air or by torpedo was the biggest danger to the squadron. So they'd have hundreds of tons of extra deck armor and big bulbous blisters added to the hulls to absorb torpedo explosions. They would also be bristling with AA guns. Remember, the Luftwaffe's bombing skills have not yet impressed anybody too much. And the goals? Cut off Germany's iron imports from Sweden, tie down German warships, convince Sweden and Norway to join the Allies, and intimidate the...
Yeah, it feels like, and Indy just said, you know, the prowess of the Luftwaffe wasn't really proven yet, and so that people didn't know how lethal it was yet in the war. But even if you can completely outclass the German Navy by going into the Baltic, you're sort of trapped and sitting ducks for the German airplanes, Air Force, Luftwaffe, that can obviously, you don't need a lot of range here, and you can just keep going from mainland Germany. It seems pretty dangerous for
USSR.
British ships.
Convince Sweden and Norway to join the Allies and intimidate the USSR. Churchill has a habit of advocating naval maneuvers away from the battlefronts. It was he who had been the strongest advocate for breaking the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli landings in World War I. He's also mechanically creative and was one of the earliest advocates of the first tank prototypes.
Yeah, if you're, you know, this kind of goes along with what I just said, is worrying about going to the Baltic, but if you have such an amazing navy as the British did, then why not just, this is a world war building up, and so supply lines matter and going around. And so you don't really have to fight near Germany or German waters to really punish them, since you can just go around the world, find who is allied with Germany or who is providing Germany with anything, and then just wreak havoc over there. I feel like that'd be a great strategy. Now, these alliances aren't as solidified this early in the war, and the supply lines probably aren't either, but you can keep them from doing so.
Opposition to Catherine came from Admiral...
Let me know if I'm wrong.
...the first tank prototypes. Opposition to Catherine came from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord. Well, it came from a lot of people, but particularly from him. Armor plating was not something that they just had hundreds of tons of sitting around. Pound also thought Churchill was underestimating the value of air power, especially with the ships moving so slowly in such confined spaces so close to Germany. And if disaster happened and the fleet was lost, Italy or Japan might join the war on Germany's side. Churchill didn't help his cause either by ordering the completion of the first King George-class battleships before Germany could get Bismarck and Tirpitz ready for action, since they used the same steel armor plates that Operation Catherine also required. He'd been pushing for this operation since September, but on January 20th, the plans were finally shelved. We've mentioned before other Allied plans for interfering with Germany's iron imports, which partly involve possibly sending troops to help the Finns in the Winter War. They might be too late for that, though. On the 29th, in diplomatic exchanges in Sweden, the Soviets indicate that they are willing to negotiate peace with the legitimate Finnish government of Ristoriti, so they no longer support...
Guys, it's interesting how... I'm kind of pausing in bad places. It's interesting, and it makes sense, but it's still interesting, how in the beginning of conflicts, especially the beginning of this conflict, I shouldn't generalize conflicts, but there aren't two sides yet, like towards the end of the war, and it makes sense that towards the end of the war, plans are hashed out and people don't have any hesitation or have much less uncertainty of what's going on, that, you have the Soviets who, although they signed a mutual, won't attack each other agreement and invaded Poland, it's still kind of like you have the Soviets, you have the Chinese, you have the Japanese, you have the British and French, you have Germany, and then you have the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, kind of like looking both ways, like, who's the best for us to join right now? And that's interesting. It might be obvious to a lot of people, but it's just interesting how the beginning of the war, there are not just allies and Axis,
exchanges in Sweden, the Soviets indicate that they are willing to negotiate peace with the legitimate Finnish government of Ristoriti, so they no longer support the puppet Kuusinen regime. What this says is that the war, while still raging in the field, is no longer a war to introduce Soviet communism into Finland, but a war about borders and fortifications, much as what the Soviet demands had ostensibly been about a few months ago. Still, round two of the fighting for the Karelian Isthmus begins this week. As I've said, the Soviet Red Army has been reorganizing, retraining, and rethinking tactics all month under General Timoshenko after the disasters in December, and the blow now falls. The plan is to ramp up the artillery day after day until a huge and sudden escalation February 1st, when airstrikes also hit the Finns, followed by localized ground attacks. This is not an attempt at a big breakthrough, though. The plan for that is for the 11th, after pounding the Finns relentlessly around the clock. Factored into Timoshenko's equation was a savage but simple truth. Russian units could be rotated, Finnish units could not. The cumulative strain on the defenders was designed to grind them down not only physically, but psychologically by depriving them of sleep, warmth, hope itself. Eventually, even Finns would reach their breaking point. The Finns know exactly what is coming, but they can't really do much to prevent it.
That's the thing, going way back to Peter the Great and like his fightings with Was Peter the Great and Charles the 12th around? Was that the same time period? Them fighting each other. But go back to the 1700s and late 1600s of Scandinavian versus Russian conflict, whether it's Finland or Sweden. That the Scandinavian countries have always been plagued by their low population, and so they are forced to adapt, and because they only have one or two chances, whereas fighting the Russians, who have the opposite, they have an enormous population, an enormous amount of land, and so can suffer a lot more mistakes. And so those both, obviously a giant advantage of Russia, the Russian Empire, and later the Soviets, of having that many people, but then they also don't get the amount of professionalism that comes with not having that many chances. But it seems like numbers will beat expertise in the end. Does that make sense?
Artillery shell shortage.
Even if you don't become as adept at fighting because they have to, still the numbers still win. Because you have to just keep winning. And here they can afford losses,
acute that batteries have orders only to fire when under direct ground attacks. Their Air Force can, in theory, strafe Soviet supply columns, but the Soviet Polikarpov interceptors make that a seriously risky proposition. They do send a recon plane through on the morning of the 1st that manages a photo shoot of the Soviet lines opposite the Soma defensive position. When they look at the photos, they are shocked to find that overnight, I mean literally overnight, the Soviet artillery has nearly doubled to 200 big guns. And this is just the visible, uncamouflaged guns against that one position. Well, later that day, the guns begin to blast while 500 planes begin the carpet bombing of Soma, which William Trotter points out is the heaviest and most sustained aerial attack in history to this point. The Finnish defenses shatter under the continued onslaught. Phone cables are destroyed. Men are buried alive. Field kitchens can only be used at night, and the smoke from any fire for warmth summons a barrage. So forget about food and warmth. But the Russians are still doing one thing now that they had done in December, taking staggering losses. See, the attacks on the 1st have the pattern: artillery and air, and then infantry and tanks come in, with the infantry assembling, approaching, and charging in the open in dense columns. Finnish machine guns just mow down the Russians, but this time, doesn't matter. Wave after wave of fresh troops will come on. 5 or 6 waves a day, no matter what the cost. That's the plan. 100 tanks would attack in a wedge, this time working closely with the infantry. So it's now suicidal for the Finns to send out anti-tank squads. And the Finns don't have enough anti-tank weaponry to even approach handling the advancing tanks. The 1st is a day of non-stop fighting, but, and this is important, the attacks are still really only probing attacks to wear down the Finns day after day until the 11th. On February 2nd, the pattern of attack is repeated, only now heavier and on a wider front as the week ends. And the month of January has just ended, of course. For that month, German U-boats sink 40 ships for 111,200 tons, with the biggest successes in the North Sea, especially near the Moray Firth. German Admiral Karl Dönitz has only 32 operational U-boats at the moment, though, so only 6 to 8 can really be on patrol at any one time. Also at the end of January, Reinhard Heydrich appoints Adolf Eichmann as head of Department 4, D4 in Berlin. The designation will change many times and will simply become known over time as the Eichmann-Referat or Judenreferat, Eichmann's department to handle the Jewish question. For now, they are to complete the deportation of Jews from the areas Germany has annexed and will be responsible for all future such deportations, both provenance and destination. And one last note. A record budget is presented in the Japanese Diet February 1st. Almost half is for the military, weaponry, and training. We'll talk more about Japan next week. This week, though, has come to its end, with the renewal of heavy Soviet hostilities on the ground in Karelia, German plans proceeding for an invasion of Norway, British plans for the Baltic being scrapped, and Japan planning to spend ever more on its military. Japan doesn't just need military for its war with China, you know. Their puppet state of Manchukuo shares a pretty long border with the USSR. And though there's been a ceasefire in effect since September, that's...
And Mongolia is... I kind of want to see behind his head here. I don't think I can right now. Is Mongolia under Soviet occupation, or is it just a close ally?
Fire in effect since September, that's not the same thing as peace. Could the Soviet Union pretty long border with the USSR?
Oh, right. Okay.
And though there's been a ceasefire in effect since September, that's not the same thing as peace. Could the Soviet Union handle a two-front war with both Finland and Japan? Would they? I don't see why.
Man, the Soviets and Chinese being on the same side would be crazy. Now, I know this isn't communist China yet, you know, it's not until after World War II ends, right, that really Maoist forces take over all of China, right? But the two seemingly unending manpower countries being together would just seem like an unstoppable force, even if you're, you know, you have better technology.
Why not? And you know why? Because the Red Army is quite clear that its plan against the Finns is to just throw men after men at them, men who die by the thousands until victory is achieved. It's hard for me to even wrap my head around the brutality of such a plan.
When you know, communism is not big on individualism, right? And so that seems to be a big perk, a horrifying perk if you're the mother or father or the soldier themselves that's being sent off. But it's like there is no political backlash in countries like this, or, you know, Japan or Germany, and in authoritarian states, right? Which the three authoritarian states here are Japan, Russia, and Germany, right? And Italy, I suppose. But where, like, you don't even have to worry about that. It's just, oh, well, this will take so many casualties. Okay, well, we have the men. Go.
But if they can do it against
crazy.
the Finns, I bet they could do it against another enemy. If you want to understand more about how the world came to a point where it was acceptable to some to organize ethnic relocations as a state matter, have a look at our Between Two Wars episode about the Greco-Turkish War right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Like Fernando, you should join the Time Ghost Army on Patreon. Every dollar makes this show better and better. The war effort needs you. See you next time.
Great video. I feel like I had a lot of bad pauses, or like where I paused in the middle of points he was trying to make and I unpause without rewinding. Sorry about that. I had a lot of things I just wanted to ask in general here, but I understood it. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you learned something or can teach me something down in the comments, or if I said something you disagree with, call me out. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys next time. I'll keep on learning. Bye.